Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
How are you, Amir?
I'm fine, Baba. Will you tell me the remaining story today?
Of course, I will tell you the remaining story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam. Now, where did we stop yesterday?
You told me till how God sent the final sign to the people of Egypt.
And what was that?
It was a sign of blood. God turned Nile water into blood.
That's very good. Insha'Allah, I will start from there. Listen carefully. Bismillah. The story of Exodus. The Egyptians refused to believe in Allah in spite of the miracles that Musa alayhi salam performed. God sent his punishments repeatedly, and the people would appeal to Musa alayhi salam, promising to release Israelites. But time and again they broke their promises. Finally, God withdrew his mercy and gave order for Musa to lead his people out of Egypt. The people carried their jewels and their other belongings with them. This mass migration was later known as Exodus. In the darkness of the night, the Prophet led his people towards the Red Sea. By now, Pharaoh realized that the Israelites had left the city. He got really angry and he assembled an army to follow and capture the Israelites. By early morning, the Israelites had reached the Red Sea. When the Prophet looked back, he could see the army getting closer and closer. He realized that they were soon going to get trapped. In front of them was the Red Sea, and to their back was Pharaoh's army. Fear and panic began to spread through the people. Musa alayhi salam walked towards the edge of the Red Sea and looked out at the horizon. It was then that Yusha alayhi salam turned to the Prophet and asked, "In front of us is this impassable barrier, the sea, and our enemy is approaching from behind. Surely death cannot be avoided." But the Prophet did not panic. He stood silently and waited for God to keep his promise to free the children of Israel. At that moment, Allah commanded the Prophet to strike the sea with his staff. Musa alayhi salam did as he was commanded. A fierce wind began to blow. The sea began to swirl and spin. And suddenly the sea parted, revealing a path for the people to walk. It was a miracle! The Prophet then led his people across the sea. As they walked, the waves stood like a mountain on each side. The Prophet ensured that everyone crossed the sea safely. When he looked back, he could see the Pharaoh and his men approaching. The Pharaoh and his army had seen the miracle as well. But the Pharaoh was a pretender. He wanted to take credit for this miracle. So he shouted to his men, "Look, the sea has opened at my command, so that we may arrest them." They rushed across the parted waters following the Israelites, but when they reached midway, the water came crashing on them. The Pharaoh realized that he was going to die. He shouted of fear, "I believe that there is no God other than Allah, and I surrender to you." But it was too late. The curtain fell under Pharaoh's tyranny, and the waves carried his body to the shore. When the Egyptians saw his dead body, they realized that the man they had worshipped could not even keep away his own death. They now knew that he was never a god. God had favored the children of Israel, and he led them safely out of Egypt. After a few days of walking in the desert, They got thirsty. God then commanded the Prophet to strike a rock with his staff. It was a miracle. There came 12 different springs of water from the rock. Each spring was meant for 12 different tribes. God did this so that there won't be any dispute while sharing the water. God also sent clouds to protect them from the scorching sun. And when they were hungry, He sent a special delicious food called manna. But in spite of God's generosity, many people kept complaining to the Prophet. Musa alayhi salam scolded the Prophet and reminded them that they had just left a life of slavery. He asked them to be happy instead and thank God for His generosity. The children of Israelites were broken people, unable to stay away from sin and corruption. They were tired of manna and tired of the traveling. They wondered if there really was a place called Canaan after all. The people kept traveling through the desert for days and days. They were walking with no destination, day and night, morning and evening. Eventually, they entered the Sinai. The Prophet realized that this was the place where he had spoken to God before his journey to Egypt. Musa alayhi salam decided to climb the mountain, so he called his brother and asked him to take charge of the people while he was gone. But before climbing the mountain, God ordered the Prophet to fast for 30 days. On the 30th day, God then asked the Prophet to fast for 10 more days. After the fast was completed, Musa alayhi salam was ready to speak to the Lord once again. He then started climbing the mountain. The climb was long and difficult. Once he reached the top, God gave him 2 tablets. In which the special laws to govern the Israelites were written. Musa alayhi salam had gone for 40 days and the people grew restless. They were like children, complaining and acting impulsively. Among them there was a man named Samiri, who was more inclined towards the evil. He suggested that they needed another guide, and he told them that the Prophet had deserted them. In order to find true guidance, you need a true God, he shouted to the Israelites. I shall provide you one. He started collecting all their jewelry at first. Then he dug a hole on the ground in which he placed a lot and put all the jewelry inside. Then he lit a fire. Samiri then made a golden calf out of the molten metal. It was as if they had succeeded in making a god. Harun alayhi salam, the brother of the Prophet, was afraid to stand up to the people at first. But when he saw the idol, he spoke up. You are committing a grave sin, he shouted to them. He warned them of the consequences for their actions. We shall stop worshipping this God only when Musa returns, they replied. Those who remained true to their belief separated themselves from the idol worshippers. They stood along with Harun alayhi salam. When Musa alayhi salam returned, he saw his people dancing around the idol. His heart was filled with shame and anger now. He threw the tablets to the ground in his anger. He then tugged Harun's beard and his hair, crying, What held you back when you saw them doing this? Why did you not fight them? O son of my mother, let go of my beard. They were about to kill me. The Prophet understood Harun's helplessness and he began to handle the situation calmly and wisely. He called Samiri and said, "Get away from here. You shall live the rest of your life alone." The Prophet sent him to exile forever. He knew that God was going to punish them for worshipping the idol. So he chose 70 seniors from each tribe and ordered them, "Rush towards Allah and repent for what you have done." He then started climbing Mount Sinai with the 70 elders. Once they reached the top, the Prophet asked the elders to wait for him, and he walked ahead. There he started communicating with God. The elders could hear Musa speaking with the God, but they could not see him. The Prophet returned after some time, and the elders told him, "O Musa, we shall never believe in you until we see Allah ourselves." Their stubborn demand was rewarded with punishing thunderbolts and an earthquake that killed all of them instantly. The Prophet was very sad now. He wondered what he would say to the children of Israelites. Those 70 men were the best of the people. So he turned to God and prayed for forgiveness. Allah heard his prayers and he raised the dead people back to life. The children of Israel wandered in the desert for many years. The Prophet suffered greatly because of the ignorance of his people. He suffered everything for the sake of his people. God never let them reach the promised land because of the sins committed by the Israelites. After a few years, Prophet Harun alayhi salam died while they were wandering in the desert. When the time of death for Musa alayhi salam arrived, the angel of death was sent to the Prophet. When the angel came to the Prophet, he slapped him on the eye. The angel returned to Lord and said, "You had sent me to a slave who didn't want to die." Then Allah said, "Return to him now. When you meet him, ask him to put his hand on the back of an ox. Tell him that for every hair that comes under his arm, he will be granted 1 year of life." The angel returned to the Prophet and gave him Allah's message. "What will happen after that?" "Death," said the angel. "Then let it come now," replied the Prophet. The Prophet then requested Allah to let him die close to the Holy Land so that he could at least see it from a distance. Allah granted his request and he died shortly after. Prophet Musa alayhi salam, the one to whom Allah spoke directly, met his death with a contented soul and a faithful heart.
MashaAllah, that was such an amazing story.
The story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam was really inspiring, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, Baba.
Now shall I start asking you a few questions? Why did the Prophet leave Egypt along with the Israelites?
The Egyptians never heeded the Prophet's request to free the Israelites, in spite of the miracles he performed. That's why he had to leave Egypt.
How did the Pharaoh die?
God parted the Red Sea for the Prophet and the Israelites. But when the Pharaoh entered the river, the water came crashing down on him.
Very good, my son. Now tell me what was written on the tablets that God gave the Prophet.
God gave him 2 tablets in which the special laws to govern the Israelites were written.
MashaAllah, that was the right answer. That's all for today, my son. I will tell you another story tomorrow. Good night, my son.
Good night, Baba.